Final Fantasy XIII is about uncovering misconceptions, living through tragedy, and finding hope. The story revolves around a few flawed individuals that eventually band together to fight fate, the destruction of their world. But things are pretty complicated because this very group of people are the ones tasked with doing the demolition. They try their best to run away from this unfair destiny until they eventually learn they can't outrun it. So they instead meet what fate has in store for them, but on their own terms. I absolutely adore Final Fantasy XIII. It's one of my favorite games, and I find everything from the fast-paced combat to the intricacies of the world fascinating. Everything that makes up the core of this game is a solid foundation, but what's built on top of it leads to 13 to being one of the least loved Final Fantasy games. But the reasons for why it's not beloved are often misunderstood. And that's exactly what I want to address, because I do believe that in many ways 13 is pretty justifiably boring, but much of the discussion around why it's boring often don't show the full picture. Much like how 13 begins with a ragtag team with conflicting interests, the way it was initially received was the start of an endless strife between much of the fanbase. Just like with the drama between the characters of 13, which there's a lot of, the conflict outside of the game is filled with many misunderstandings that are based on being seen from the wrong perspective. Much of the criticism surrounding 13 is that it's too linear, and this will often be the only reason given as to why it's boring. These feelings pretty naturally led the game to be known as a nice-looking hallway simulator. I wouldn't say that's the wrong outlook because it can feel super narrow at times, but to say its linear nature is the only reason as to why it's boring is a misconception. The blame has been misplaced. I want to address exactly why 13's aggressive linearity is not what makes the game boring, and what makes it feel like a hallway simulator is instead a mix of many other factors. I think the most crucial part in understanding this misconception is that Final Fantasy games have always been this linear. 13 just makes it more clear than ever before. If we took each area of any beloved Final Fantasy game like 7 or 9, smashed all their separate maps together, then stuck a mini-map in the corner, we would get a bunch of hallways. Final Fantasy X is the perfect example of this. It's just as linear as 13 for much of the game, if not more. Despite its straightforward nature, it didn't receive anywhere as much hate for it because people found it enjoyable. In fact, 10 is one of the most loved games in the series. It's not at all wrong to say that 13 can feel like a hallway simulator at times because just like 10, it often does. Yet the linear nature of the game isn't the reason as to why people get bored. Some may mention, well, what about towns and other more open areas to explore? Surely it would make a difference. These can certainly bring aspects of a world to life, but even if 13 was expanded to include more cities, players would still get bored. We can see games that have come after 13, such as The Last of Us and God of War, be just as egregiously linear and find incredible success. There were even games released near the same time as 13 that were also very linear and not claimed to be boring because of it, like Uncharted and BioShock. So despite these allegations of linear is bad, it doesn't seem to be true considering the success of linear storytelling games. If done correctly, a linear design can often be the best way to tell a story. Non-linearity in games is often praised but can end up being detrimental to the moment-to-moment experience. Like if players end up going down a path that has much worse pacing. Dark Souls 1 has a really famous example of this, where once you exit the tutorial, you come across what may seem like a fork in the road, but going in any direction that isn't the undead burg can make it a far more miserable time than it would be otherwise. Most games tend to trend more linear overall, and even if they have sections of non-linearity, they typically have you set down a very specific path. Final Fantasy games sit in a sort of middle ground where they include long sections of high linearity followed up with sections of non-linearity. This is usually something like moving from a more enclosed pathway like a dungeon or a cave to more open spaces like a city or the overworld. But 13 gets rid of this pattern entirely by having little to no exploration until around 20 or so hours into the game. Fans of the Final Fantasy series hold a lot of expectations from previous games, and 13 decides to take those and then toss them off a 100-story building. One of the more important tropes that gets discarded is the ability to explore and interact with things in the world, like talking to people in a town, or clicking on some kind of random object that has a hidden item, to even just learning about something from interacting with it. All these important ways of experiencing the world are missing, and it results in a really crucial problem. Because the purpose of most JRPGs like Final Fantasy games is to tell a story, often a pretty confusingly dramatic one.
Looks like chaos has been waiting for us.
But even more importantly, they're stories you can interact with, otherwise they may as well have been a movie or a TV show. Allowing the player to have some semblance of control adds layers to the ways in which storytelling can be immersive. Not just through something like combat, but even walking around the world, like into a random house and then speaking with the characters in town, or finding goodies on the ground. Interactions like these are kind of what make games games. It's how they differentiate themselves from other ways of storytelling. Final Fantasy games also use interactions like these to their advantage to give players a choice of what they prefer to experience in the game. You can run around and explore town, or skip straight to doing the story. Some players may go as far as to talking to every character and searching every nook and cranny to experience as much of the world as the game has to offer. While others may only love a game for its combat alone, so they skip every cutscene and just run around and fight as much as they possibly can. The most dramatic example of this style of world building and story exploration brings us back to Dark Souls, because Dark Souls is a game where the experience of the world and story is totally dependent on the player's dedication to uncovering it. It's the kind of game you can complete 100% of and then have no idea what in the world is going on at the end. This crucial aspect of the way Square Enix and Falcom-like JRPGs build their worlds has been almost totally left out of 13. Which is strange because there's an expectation for these kinds of games to be more open and have these non-linear exploration sections where they can uncover what the world is like. But with 13, players hardly get that at all, and when you do, it's minuscule, and strangely it feels out of place. This missing part of the game gets a lot of flack because it's something, again, that is expected. Although I think a game can still be successful without designing interactables like this, but 13 removes so many kinds of interactions without replacing them with anything. This is of course a huge issue and is probably the largest reason as to why 13 feels like a hallway simulator at times. But it still doesn't completely address all the problems at play. Adding more ways to interact in 13 would make it a much better game, but at the same time, even if this was the case, many of the same people would still find 13 boring. So if the problem with 13 isn't necessarily that it's too linear, that it doesn't have towns, or there aren't enough interactables, then what went wrong? What did all these other linear storytelling games do well that 13 has missed the mark on? In the design process for 13, Square Enix set out to create something that was a bit of a departure from their previous games, with the ultimate goal being to create an experience that feels like a movie is playing out. Previous Final Fantasy games often achieve this feeling in moments with a focus on extravagant cutscenes and epic battles where you fight the gods. But this only happens in parts. The rest of the experience still feels like a regular game. So in order to succeed in creating something that is more movie-like for a long period, it requires the game to be designed totally differently. It's tough to get movie-like pacing if you have these longer periods where you can spend hours just running through a town or something totally unrelated to the story. Anyways, Square's solution is to make their more movie-like part of the game as linear as possible in order to give a more intentional and tailored experience. The result of 13's design is a game and story that is one of the most inspired, yet unique I've experienced. It has clear inspiration from 7 in both setting and characters, but still stands firmly on its own. And when the game is at its best, they achieve their movie-like quality to a high degree. It also doesn't hurt that the quality of the graphics still hold up today and were some of the most exceptional of its time. What ends up being the largest problem with 13 is that it doesn't hit this movie-like pacing consistently, especially early on. And this is the true problem with 13. Players got bored because the game has horrible pacing. Every problem we've encountered so far are symptoms of this much larger pacing issue within the game. When the sections are poorly paced in 13, it's because the gameplay has been misaligned in nearly every aspect of the design. The story, the characters, and even the gameplay all develop too slowly. And to make matters even worse, when the pacing is bad, the game starts to feel non-interactive. Which is why 13 can feel incredibly boring at times, because the entire point of a game is interaction. But 13 isn't unredeemable, and a lot of these issues are solvable without changing much of the game's foundational design. Because what's at the core of 13 is an absolutely incredible game, it's just strung together really poorly. Most of the changes that are needed are gonna sound a bit obvious, but are about creating much better pacing by more often changing up the gameplay that happens in the first 20 or so hours of the game. And how to do that is by more intentionally designing the gameplay with the current story in mind. Early on, the gameplay too often feels disconnected from what's actually happening in the story. As I mentioned earlier, a missing piece of this puzzle is that 13 doesn't make the world feel as interactive as the previous games do. But this wasn't something that came about naturally. Not making the world as interactive was actually a deliberate choice. Toriyama, the director of 13, has talked a bit in interviews about how they chose to design 13. And he quite plainly says that the placing of interactables in the world, like in previous games, was avoided on purpose. Which seems like a pretty wild decision, but he has his reasons for it. He talks about this in the context of wanting to transcend the genre of the JRPG to create something new. Toriyama continues to say that the design of 13 is almost more like an FPS than a JRPG, and if you play 13, maybe you can understand what he means, because much like an FPS, 13 is trying to emulate a constant feeling of urgency with one path forward. This idea is an interesting twist on the JRPG, and I think it can work well if done correctly, but clearly with 13's reputation, they didn't execute on it very well. And I'll do my best to try to make sense of what went wrong here. Ultimately, this sense of urgency that they tried to create isn't really felt for much of the game, and in many cases it was unnecessary. 13 doesn't design the gameplay around this kind of storytelling well enough when trying to create this feeling in the player, so certain sections of the game are put in this weird limbo, where you don't feel much of anything, let alone urgency, and the pacing suffers immensely for it. If Toriyama wanted to make this more like an FPS, it would have been more ideal to have some sort of constant action going on in the world, like enemies actively looking for you or chasing you at all times, or someone to follow and push you along. Because if you remove ways for a player to interact with the world, then you instead need to find ways for the world to interact with the player, especially if you want to create urgency. But because this doesn't happen in 13, the gameplay feels off. You're never given a reason to move down the hallway. There's a missing connection between gameplay and story. Near the very start of the game, right after you do the tutorial fight, you come across what may seem to be some sort of portal. This is one of the few times that some artifact or thing in the world is even shown to you and that a companion has some sort of response to it. But then there's zero available interaction with it, which might have been the designers trying to signal there's no reason to run around and look at things. There's nothing you can do with them. The intention of not including more branching paths and interactables is meant to help create a sense of urgency and fast pacing. Lightning has better things to do than look at portals and we need to move on. Yet the problem is that there's nothing about the gameplay that's designed to push you forward. An urgency can be felt through 13's story and visuals, but not at all through its gameplay or the character motivations. While the story is fast-paced, interesting, and clearly wants you to push forward, the game itself isn't doing you any favors. Shouldn't there be some soldiers or some sort of other flying vehicle chasing me down by now? Sure, there is resistance down the path, but if anything, that makes me more cautious than wanting to push ahead. There's a huge myriad of situations that could have been contrived to create urgency, but 13 doesn't create any, or really give you any kind of direction. You just have to go forward because there's literally nowhere else to go. There's an obvious plot device they could have used to at least give us more meaning in our path forward, the pulsed fallacy vessel, which are these kind of giant vehicles that hold godlike machines that take care of the world. It's pretty out there, I know, but they could have made it more clear from the start that that's where Lightning, our protagonist, wants to go. They do mention it briefly, but it's not made very clear, nor do we really even know what the heck a pulse fallacy vessel is at this point. Some sort of in-game event or timer could have helped with this a lot as well, like requiring the player to place a bomb in the distance or something, so you can get across some rubble, blast some soldiers out of the way, or maybe, I don't know, you're blowing up some sort of reactor. You've got 10 minutes to do it or game over. Oops, I'm kind of describing the opening plot of Final Fantasy VII. Interestingly, the team that made 7 is still much of the same team that created 13. With the two main scenario designers from both 7s still working on 13. Clearly, they know how to create scenarios that force urgency on players, but somehow something got lost because the urgency in the story doesn't translate to the gameplay at all in many situations. We've only scratched the surface, but it's easy to see what you can expect gameplay to be like for the rest of 13. It all unfortunately follows this design of relying on the story to create urgency. But to their credit, it can actually work at times and work really well. But when it doesn't, you're not given any direction or reason to move forward other than you're running away from being captured. This makes sense with the story, but the game just doesn't help push you in a way that makes it feel like an urgency exists. In previous titles, we can see how the same team creates similar design structures but make it work. In 9, there's a section where you play as a knight known as Steiner looking for Princess Garnet, who is suddenly missing. You're set out with the goal of running around the castle to look for her and find out what's happened. The character motivations and plot are fairly simple, but because we have them at all, we get that feeling of urgency despite being in exploration mode. This works simply because the story and characters and the gameplay all mesh together well and feel connected. In 13, we don't really understand anyone's motivations for a long time. It's fine if they want to keep that hidden, but we still need some sort of motivation to drive us in a direction, even if it's already a hallway. If we're not going to have internal motivations revealed just yet, we need to at least have some sort of external ones. Like a bomb, or that your sister has been kidnapped, which literally is what Final Fantasy XIII is about in the beginning, but they don't tell you that until you pretty much find her, which I find to be really, really insane. We don't learn that this is our main character's motivation until around an hour and 25 minutes into playing the game, and then not even 10 minutes later, you find her. Imagine if we didn't learn that the plot of Taken is that his daughter had been kidnapped until right before he saves her. It's crazy to think just how much more of a slam dunk the opening of 13 could have been if we instead just understood Lightning's motives from the start. One of my main frustrations with 13 is that its super linear design can work and be used to make the pacing of the game better, but it doesn't do this effectively. We can see how even in games like Final Fantasy X that a more linear path at times would actually be beneficial to the game's pacing. There's one really specific nitpick I have near the beginning of 10, after you fall off Riku's ship and Waka finds you laying in the ocean. We already have really clear motivation of what we want to do here because we're constantly in Tidus's head, and we find some Blitzball players, and we love Blitzball so we gotta check that out. But for some reason there are branching paths here. Instead of doing what makes the most sense and immediately swimming up to Waka, you might swim around the beach and find a hidden treasure chest, or explore what's on the dock. It's a really strange decision to have branching paths in the game at this moment, it just doesn't feel right, and it really doesn't benefit the game much here either. There are of course times where these kinds of branching paths with exploration and hidden treasures do add to the gameplay, but it would make a lot more sense for things like this to exist on the way to Besaid Village and of course in the village itself. 10 has a few weird pacing problems like this scattered throughout the game where it's not straightforward enough about how to move on, and sometimes the pacing of the game suffers for it. So my point here is that 13's design can be successful because when the pacing is good in 13, it's really good. There's a lot of scenarios later in the game that have been put together incredibly well due to the player actually understanding the characters and their motives, and 13 begins to shine. One section that comes to mind is a sequence where you board an enormous enemy airship that currently has some teammates as prisoners. You've got the other part of your crew, and the plan is simple. Let's go save our friends. And then you have the flip side of this, where the pacing of 13 is at its worst, and urgency doesn't exist. But the design of the gameplay doesn't change, which makes sections like these the most boring by far. But they could have been some of the best experiences in the game, if they had been instead molded to be explored with interactables and more non-linear pathways like in previous games. Or just some sort of minigame to play while we're here. Weaving these kinds of relaxed exploration areas in between some of the hyperlinear urgent sections of the game would have been a great way to mix up the pacing. But running through the Garpa Whitewood as Hope and Lightning unfortunately showcases how to make your game as boring as possible. This place is a giant forest-like area that is maintained by the military to breed animals used for war. A kind of military zoo. It sounds cool in concept, but again, there's not actually anything to explore here or anything laying around that could give us any insights into it. It's a place where there should be little to no urgency because we've lost track of the military that was chasing us down, but it's still designed as if there is urgency and that we can't take our time and rest. Both the gameplay and story are totally out of sync with each other, and it creates one of the lowest points of interactivity in the game, which leaves it to be one of the most miserable sections of the game to get through. And unfortunately, we don't only have this issue once, but twice. The Sunlith Waterscape is a beautiful area to run through in 13, but holds the same flaws as the Garpa Whitewood. The gameplay feels like it should be relaxed and without urgency, but again is not designed with that idea in mind at all. They do at least try to add something to interact with here by adding a weather system. It feels like they might have had a more robust interaction here planned, like opening new pathways and places to go, but ultimately it's not used for much other than changing what enemies show up. There's also really nothing in this area really explaining why these devices exist or who put them here unless you go into the data log and read about the Sunless Waterscape. The data log will tell you that, like Dagarpa Whitewood, this is also an experimental facility on Cocoon, but to test weather patterns. This area is beautiful and interesting, but is unfortunately another casualty of the constant refusal to change up the gameplay. And again, this is the largest reason as to why 13 is considered to be a hallway simulator to many. Not only because of its linear nature, but because so much interaction has been removed from the game that all you do for so much of it is run down a single path and fight endless hordes of enemies. This isn't nearly as much of a problem when the story's pacing and character motivations align, but it still remains a huge issue with the first half of the game. I want to come back to 10 again because most of the team that created 10 was much of the same that made 13, yet 10 is far more beloved than 13, with most polls in the fanbase ranking it somewhere around 4th, and in Japan it's at the top. One thing I noticed right away while playing 10 after 13 is there aren't nearly as many battles in the beginning. In 13 you're constantly fighting, and it's literally the first thing you'll do in the game when you can control lightning. In fact, you battle nearly twice as much in the first 2 hours of 13 than the first 2 hours of 10. In 13, you engage in combat nearly 50 times in the first 2 hours. And in 10, it's likely to be somewhere between 20 and 25, but is a bit random. 13's worst issue with pacing is that the only reprieve you're ever given from fighting over and over again are the cutscenes in between. In 10, you're constantly presented with different kinds of gameplay to break up all the fighting. This makes the pacing significantly smoother and varied by having periods of exploring the world, doing a shrine puzzle, or playing a quick round of blitzball. These sections are often fairly straightforward and don't always have the most exciting gameplay elements, but having something different at all is what gives 10 a better flow. When we get to combat sections of 10, it's much like 13, except 13 only has combat sections. 13 desperately needed something in between to break up the pacing. For instance, early on in the game, when we're inside the Pulse Foul Sea Vessel, there was a really good opportunity to create something akin to a shrine puzzle. There's a section with these twisting and branching pathways, and all of them lead to different pillars that look as if they were meant to be something to be interacted with. But instead of a puzzle, the only thing we get here are more enemies to fight. Some kind of scenario should have been introduced where players need to overcome something that isn't slaying 10 more creatures. 13 is monotone in its gameplay, and it's the reason as to why it wasn't as well received as other linear storytelling games that were previously mentioned. Games like Uncharted and The Last of Us are filled with a larger variety of ways to play the game that keeps players interested. In Uncharted, you'll go from a gunfight to climbing walls to solving a small puzzle. God of War will also break up its hordes of enemies to fight with small areas to explore and puzzles to solve. Sections like these don't need to be anything special either, there just needs to be some kind of gameplay that's different and adds flavor to your game. If 13 was like eating ice cream, it would be like eating a flavorless ice cream for 20 hours straight with some sprinkles of vanilla every now and then. Which some people might really like, but most people would get bored pretty quickly and want to experiment and find some kind of variety. And this is exactly why other Final Fantasy games are so successful in comparison, because they contain so many different scenarios that have you do ridiculous things that add color to the gameplay. Like Cloud running around to find out how to cross-dress to save Tifa, or just playing Blitzball in 10, doing a squatting competition. Maybe you'll find yourself running around and stealing clothes to get out of town as Locke, or distracting a crowd with a swordplay spectacle as Zidane, or even just jump roping as Vivi. But while playing 13, it often felt like they wanted to maintain this far more serious tone, and they didn't know how to incorporate different gameplay scenarios without ruining it. That, or they thought it would ruin their attempt at movie-like pacing. Nautilus feels like the only break we get from constantly fighting, making it one of the most standout sections of the game. It puts you in a setting where you can actually run around and see what people are saying, and it finally feels like we're in the world of 13. But for being a giant city amusement park, or the City of Dreams, it would be tough to tell without the story constantly slamming that in your face. There's no gameplay here that includes the theme. You can run around and look at chocobos, but there's no roller coaster ride or any kind of arcade minigame, and I have to wonder why. These kinds of things would add a lot to the immersion, and would of course be another good way to break up the pacing. At one point during the scrapyard section, we get to take control of a large robot and plow our way through hordes of enemies, which is really fun, and I wish the scenario designers of 13 would have thought up more situations like this to help break things up. 13 has an incredibly well thought out world that ultimately results in it feeling horribly bland and boring because you hardly ever get to interact with it in meaningful ways. In 10, one of the main focuses of the entire world is Blitzball. It's kind of like a fantasy version of water polo, but it's played entirely underwater. And on top of that, your character is a Blitzball Pro. It only makes sense that you actually get to play Blitzball during the game. It might not be the most exciting or fun minigame I've ever played, but it adds to the immersion of being in the world. It breaks the game up, it tells a good story, and makes the pacing of the game way better. In 13, one of the main focuses of the story is the machine godlike figures, the fal'Cie, who rule over the humans of the world, Cocoon. But we hardly ever get to interact with them, even though they are one of the main tenets of the game and are constantly talked about. We get to see them here and there, but you really only ever get to fight like 3 of them, one of which you fight on 3 different occasions. There's a section in the city Palampolum where we meet a fal'Cie that is in charge of the food distribution of humans in Cocoon. We are told just that and then go through and fight enemies like every other section of the game. But this could have been so much more, where maybe some sort of meltdown happens for some reason and we have to deal with it, then ending it with like finding the fal'Cie or fixing it or literally anything. There's so much room here to create scenarios for the players to interact with this enormous data log of lore that's been created, but it's just never utilized. It seriously feels like that somewhere between 10 and 13 that Square lost sight of what made their previous games so loved and great to play. To make matters even worse for much of the early pacing of 13, which is hard to do, is that combat tends to be more boring than it should be because it lacks a third party member, which is not good at all for the game considering it's the only gameplay that you get to do for around 95% of it, especially in the first 20 hours. The party becomes divided in order to give a little more insight into each character and help develop the plots for each of them. This can have a lot of upsides in story, but the damage this brings to the gameplay is tremendous. Combat has evolved quite a lot in 13, and I think it's actually one of the most fun combat systems in a Final Fantasy game. When you're in combat, it's constantly happening, and when the game is at its best, it's really engaging. But it has a few problems that hold it back from being exceptionally good, or even one of the best JRPG combat systems ever. With just a few tweaks and some little things switched around, they could have gotten there. Or if Persona 5 had already existed, so they could have stolen from that like I'm about to talk about. First, let's take a look at how the combat system in 13 works. Unlike previous games where you can command each character, now you only have control over the party leader. And instead of choosing one attack at a time, you can queue up as many as 5 or 6. This is what's called the ATB bar. It fills up over time. In previous titles, ATB was used to give different characters different attack timings in a turn-based setting. It's a similar approach, except it's more about how many actions rather than having a turn. You can select actions, and then whenever you have enough of the bar filled up, your character does those actions. This bar will be constantly filling up unless your character is already performing an action. Next are roles. Each character can have a class like fighter, healer, tank, and so on. And then your group can swap roles at any point during the battle using the paradigm system. Paradigms are set up before the fight happens and are a specific set of roles chosen for each character. So for example, you can set up a paradigm that is something like mage, and fighter, with the only stipulation being that you're limited to just 6 different paradigms at any one time. This limits you a bit on different stances and forces you to think about what's most important to your strategy. This is also important because characters can only use skills from their current role, so to heal someone you'll have to swap someone to be a healer using a paradigm shift. It's all a bit confusing at first, but once you gain mastery over this system, a lot of creativity for different strategies on how you want to go about fighting opens up. There also exists a stagger system. Each time an enemy is hit, it gains a certain amount of stagger. If the enemy isn't hit within a certain amount of time since the last stagger was applied, it loses everything built up. Once the stagger bar is filled all the way up, it puts enemies in a state where they become vulnerable to crowd control, like knocking them into the air, and debuffs such as removing their magic resistances. They will also take more damage based on the amount of current stagger that's applied, which can be seen from the number above their stagger bar. This also creates strategies to play around different classes like the fighter of this game. They don't add very much stagger to the bar, but the stagger bar will deplete more slowly when they attack, while the mage class will generate a ton of stagger, but using only spells will mean the stagger falls off much more quickly. The paradigm system is really all about finding the right balance of the toolset you're given, using the right amount of buffs and debuffs to optimize your damage while staying alive using the tanks and healers when needed. Every single class becomes important to incorporate correctly in the more intricate boss battles. This system is incredibly fun to play around with, and getting your strategies to work efficiently and effectively against different enemies is really fun. Early on it suffers because you don't end up playing with the full toolset for a really long time. So it has this weird duality in the game where it can be one of the most interactive battle systems you'll ever use, and also one of the least. There's a few reasons as to why combat can feel non-interactive at times, especially early on, with a big one being that early on you don't have a lot of options, but the main source of this issue that persists through the entirety of 13 is the auto battle option. The speed of battles is pretty fast in 13, and at times it's difficult to put commands in faster than your ATB fills up, making it tough to maximize your damage. This ATB efficiency problem continues to build on itself later once you start buffing your party with haste, making the ATB fill even faster. So the devs thought it was a good idea to add a way to quickly send out a whole batch of commands if you're struggling to match the pace of the battle. On top of this, pressing auto battle can often be just as good as choosing your own commands. Although the farther you get into the game, the less effective auto battle becomes, it will always be good enough to get you through the entirety of the game. There are some subtle things you can do to improve your damage by inputting your own commands, making it a stronger strategy, but the effort required to pull this off usually isn't worth it. Because most of the time, the difference in your damage will be really small. It's just a lot easier to click auto battle instead of becoming proficient at inputting your own commands for such tiny gains, which makes the game less interactive and also less fun. 13's combat system isn't bad at all, it's just designed in a way that allows people to circumvent using it as intended. So how do we fix this? How can you make it so players will want to interact with the combat system and not only click auto battle? Or even better, can we improve the menu design in a way that lets us remove auto battle entirely? This is where inspiration from Persona 5 could have made this game's combat one of the best turn-based systems to exist. As many of you probably know, Atlus's Persona 5 has some of the best menu designs in any game, period, and for good reason. Making the menu more efficient and interactive is what makes the combat system more fun. When combat is boiled down to a menu, and that's pretty much all you're interacting with when playing, it simply just makes sense to have the menus be fun to use. So let's take a quick look at what using 13's menu system is like to understand where the flaws are and how we can incorporate what Persona does. First of all, you have to move up and down to select from the menu, as well as do the same thing in the next menu you're given. This combat system is just a huge layer of different menus. This is fine, but the way you access and control them is incredibly inefficient. For instance, there's no way to select one attack option and have it fill up the rest of your ATB bar, which is something you'll want to do pretty often. And lastly, being forced to choose an enemy from a menu every single time you do an action is incredibly redundant. So the main goal for this menu redesign is reducing the amount of inputs needed to remove all this redundancy, which increases how quickly you can do different actions, making the menu feel way more fluid and fun to use, and also allows you to fill up the ATB bar quick enough. Here's the suggestions, or what we need to steal. Each selection in the main combat menu should be replaced with a corresponding button on the controller, exactly like how Persona 5's combat menus do it. This makes choosing what you want to do far quicker and feel better to do. Strangely, they came close to figuring this out themselves because they made a paradigm shift button instead of having it on the menu. Anyways, next we'll change the enemy selection to no longer be a separate menu. Instead, we should have a cursor above enemies' heads that can be moved using either the control stick or the D-pad. This way you can choose whatever enemy you want to attack at any time, and you don't have to click an extra button each and every time and go through another menu. It should also be obvious and clear which enemy is selected by highlighting their HP and forcing the camera to focus on them a bit more. These changes alone would create a huge reduction in the amount of button presses that you need to do to fill the ATB, allowing us to remove the auto battle option entirely. They would also just make combat more enjoyable, as well as make target selection easier and more understandable. It never made sense to me that the last thing we do in 13's combat is choose our target, because when I'm thinking about my strategy, it's typically the very first thing I need to think about when attacking multiple enemies. Some other changes I would like to see would be a way to mark favorite abilities, or simply be able to change the order abilities appear in on each menu. There should also be a way to fill up the ATB with a selected action. One button on the controller should be a modifier that means fill inside of your action menu. For example, holding this fill button and then pressing an action to fill up the rest of the ATB with as many of that selected action as possible. In game, this might look like selecting the rune ability and then holding my fill button and then selecting the action attack to fill up the rest of my ATB bar. One other small problem is that once you switch paradigms, the battle still flows as normal. There's this really long animation that happens while you watch your party change roles for some reason, and clicking auto battle after a paradigm shift is almost always the best option since your ATB will be full. But I believe this is something that's been fixed in 13.2 by shortening the animation, or maybe they removed it entirely, I'm not sure. It's hard for me to know because I've never played it. I know, shocking. Incorporating all these changes would make for a much better combat experience, especially when you consider just how many times you'll have to select attacks through an entire playthrough. This will save you thousands of inputs, maybe more. It's unfortunate that Final Fantasy XIII didn't have Persona 5 to steal from yet. Overall, combat is still incredibly fun later in the game, but is so close to being the pinnacle of a JRPG turn-based combat system. And I feel like if they would have iterated on it just a little bit more, it would have been really fun over the next few games. One of the most awkward things about combat actually comes from outside of it, because the way you encounter enemies in this game is no longer random, but instead you run into them on the map. As you play through much of the beginning of the game, you might start to feel like it was a pretty weird decision to design it this way. Like, why are the enemies just sitting here in my path? Shouldn't these soldiers be actively searching for me instead of just bumming around in this hallway? And here's where I put on my tinfoil hat for a bit because I couldn't find any information surrounding my theory on how this game might have been designed. But 13 feels like two games designed by different studios that shared the artists and then smashed those two games together. I say this because after the first 20 hours of the game, the way you play completely changes. We go from super linear story movie mode for like half the game to semi-open world exploration for a pretty long time. So what I really mean is that it feels like the core gameplay was designed entirely around exploring and fighting enemies in Grand Pulse, and then they attempted to force that same style into the first 20 hours of the game. I don't want to talk about this too long since it's mostly just a guess, but I do know 13 had quite the troubled development, and the result of the first 20 hours may have just been what they were able to rush out using what they had developed after creating Grand Pulse first. Again, it's just a wild guess though. In the end, 13 has a ton of issues, but still remains one of my favorite games despite its flaws, because what's at the core of it is amazing. Square took a lot of risks when creating it, and unfortunately a lot of them didn't work out. This game could have been genre defining and we could have seen so much more from it. But it goes to show you how important every aspect of design is, and if just a few things are misaligned, it can really change how the experience pans out. Although it's not like 13 was a total failure, because it seems clear from the success of the Final Fantasy VII Remake that 13's team took what they learned and did a great job of adapting it elsewhere. There's no denying that 13 is a flawed game, but much of the criticism surrounding it falsely accused the game of being boring for the wrong reasons, and I wanted to sort of set that straight. I hope this helps many to see 13 and the rest of the series in some kind of new light. I think it would be really interesting to see something like a re-envisioning of 13, or something heavily inspired by it would be cool. There's a ton of really great things here to take away from the game, and it would be a shame to see what could be such a cool combat system and world go to waste. Anyways, that's all I have to say for now, and thanks for watching, and see you next time.